just to mention it because I know I'm going to move on to discussing mobility as well. Like mobility is also something that comes as a result of resistance training, because mobility, like the actual definition of mobility, is effectively just the ability to move. Okay, so that's quite simple. But the way people understand it, obviously, is or the way it's used colloquially, is mobility in terms of being able to move through large joint ranges of motion. Okay, so effectively flexibility, but typically being able to control it actively is how people would refer to it as. So mobility and flexibility are also going to be trained when you're doing resistance training. This is especially the case when you're training through large ranges of motion. Okay, so if you're going down in a squat, you're getting a deep stretch in your quads at the bottom. If you're coming down on a bench press, you're getting a stretch in your chest. It doesn't mean you always have to go as low as possible, but there's certainly a very significant stimulus for gaining or maintaining joint range of motion, especially if it's something that's limited. And that's an important point here, because the only reason you'd really have that as a stated goal is if there's a limitation. And for most people who are maybe are lacking in mobility, sorry if you can hear the bins outside as well. There's a bin truck. For most people who are lacking in mobility, or who would have that goal, they might be saying, I've always been stiff in my hamstrings. So they're going to notice a key benefit from doing things like Romanian deadlifts or stiff-legged deadlifts without it having to be exaggerated too much. Now, there's obviously certain populations like certain martial arts, dancing, etc., where you may need more extreme ranges of motion, and therefore that may require more specific programming with your resistance training, whether it be, Jefferson curls or, weighted box splits or something like that. But that's not most people. It's really not most people. So stretching, unloaded stretching, even that's still somewhere on that resistance training spectrum. Because what are you doing when you do a stretch? When you grab your toes and do a hamstring stretch and pull yourself, you're applying resistance. That's exactly what you're doing. You're pulling yourself into that lengthened range of those respective muscles that you're stretching. So you're applying a stretch, you're applying force.
Thinking of this is like, try to think of how you would stretch your hamstring in a pool. It's like,
Yeah.
there's less weight, there's less gravity, or whatever you want to call it, because you're in water, right? It's like, how would you actually do that? Well, you have to actually put some force on this. Like maybe you're grabbing your foot and maybe you're pushing your knee down or something. So you're like, there are actually significant forces involved here. Therefore, I have to have strength in this position.
Yes, exactly. And so stretching is somewhere on that spectrum as well when it comes to mobility training. We generally consider it to be a lower priority component of fitness for most of our clients, because most people um, don't need specific, stretching routines that they need to follow, or specific mobility routines that they need to follow. There are some specific cases where if people are doing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu or taekwondo, ballet, etc., where they may need some quite a bit of supplementary mobility work, especially if they're not able to perform the specific moves or sequences that are required. Okay, so that's sport specific, but that's not most people. So for the vast majority of the time, we consider resistance training to take care of one's mobility needs. And if we identify specific areas where someone has a deficit, we might, zoom in on that a little bit more. Do you feel that summarizes the resistance training and mobility, I guess, component?
Yeah, 100%. And just on that mobility aspect, like again, like you said, for the vast majority of people, it's not useless per se, but it's just not the most effective use of your time, right? Like, as you said, you might use some targeted mobility, stretching work, whatever. For example, you might be doing squats and you might be like, like my adductors are a little bit, tighter than I would like them to be. And while, yeah, they will stretch out naturally just by getting better at squatting, like you might want to do some adductor stretching, going into that session or before that session or after that session or whatever, right? Same with calves, for example. Like maybe you do a lot of running and you also want to improve your squat. And you're like, my calves feel a little bit tighter. And like maybe you want to, do some calf stretching. Now we could also argue that maybe you just want to do some like anterior tib strengthening to, potentially get the same benefit, but I digress. So that is important to know, that like for the vast majority of people, you do not need to be spending 20, 40, 50 minutes doing a mobility session before you actually even get into your session, because people actually do that, and it's like, what are you actually accomplishing versus just doing the exercises you want to be able to do, right? And then slowly improving your range over time.